this is Professor Rod Evans, and this is Philosophy 110P, Introduction to Philosophy. The only book that you're going to need for this course is this book, Philosophy, Contemporary Perspectives on Perennial Issues, the 4th edition from Klemke, editor Klemke, and some others. But Klemke, K-L-E-M-K-E, and the ISBN is 0312 08478 0312 08478. That's the only book you'll need. All the readings will be in that book. And you get a good copy of this, a used copy, for very little money on Amazon, for example, if you didn't want to go through ODU. In any event, this course, as the name suggests, is Introduction to Philosophy. I want to talk a bit about the syllabus. Okay, so we've talked about the text. This course is to get you to think philosophically, and we're going to talk about the nature of knowledge, morality, legal punishment, and other areas as well. And we want you to have a kind of an understanding of what philosophy is. Philosophy, first of all, what does the word philosophy literally mean? If you were to break it down into its parts, it's love of wisdom, love of wisdom. And so philosophers historically have talked about the ultimate nature of things, the ultimate nature of things, the ultimate nature of what exists, the ultimate nature of knowledge, the ultimate nature of morality, the ultimate nature of beauty. And those were some of the key areas and have been some of the key areas of philosophy. Our grading scale for this course, 93 to 100 A, 90 to 92 A minus, 87 to 89 B plus. All of this is on your syllabus. I want to mention also the syllabus also talks about student conduct and academic integrity, and talks a little bit about plagiarism and warns against it. Now, the other thing is I want to talk about the grading criteria. There are actually going to be 5 sources of grades. We're going to have the first test, the second test, the third test, the final exam, and a paper. And each will count 1/5 or 20%. Okay, now, the paper, by the way, can be on anything at all, even remotely related to your book. If it's not at all even remotely related to your book, and it's not something that we've been talking about in class, you should ask me whether it's an appropriate topic. But what are some appropriate topics? The problem of evil, capitalism versus socialism, capital punishment, knowledge of the physical world, ethical theories, including utilitarianism, the legalization of pot would be something that you could do, or euthanasia, for or against. All of those topics would be fine. If you want to do something unrelated to what I mentioned and unrelated to anything in the book, please ask me whether it's an appropriate topic. I want to mention furthermore that the paper will be roughly 1,250 words long, double spaced. Whatever sources you use, whether it's just the book or other sources, you will note either within the body of the paper or in the endnotes. Okay, it's going to be an argumentative paper. To find out what do I mean by that, you go to Blackboard, and then you look under syllabus, and it'll have all the documents. It'll have all the review sheets for the course. It'll also have how to write an argumentative paper. So you really need to look at that closely. You don't have to follow it critically, but it'll give you a rough idea of the structure of the argumentative paper. So you'll be having a thesis statement, and then you'll have 3 to 5 reasons in favor of the thesis, and for each reason you have in favor, you'll try to come up with at least one objection, and then you'll try to show that even though the objection may have some merit, it's not fatal for your thesis, and then you'll have a concluding and summarizing paragraph. But anyway, I suggest that you look very closely at that document under syllabus on Blackboard. Okay, so what I want to do now is talk about the nature of philosophy. Okay. Now, by the way, this course is going to contain video lectures plus it'll contain written lectures. Okay, and they're they're obviously related. There's some overlap, but it's great to be able to do both, and plus you should be doing the readings. Okay, now in any event, let's talk about the subject matter of philosophy. There are different branches of philosophy. For example, there's ethics. Ethics deals with the nature of right and wrong. Ethics is a branch of philosophy asking what sort of lives should people lead. What are the goals most worthy of our achievement? Okay, how should we organize our lives morally? Morally speaking, what is the good life? Okay, all of those questions connect to ethics. There are different ethical theories. Some are based on religion, some are not. Some, for example, there's utilitarianism. Create the greatest good for the greatest number, and that has a lot going for it. At the same time, some people have criticized the theory by saying that could lead the majority to mistreat individuals or minorities. Someone could try to justify 99% of the people enslaving a minority, for example. That's one of the criticisms of utilitarianism, and there are different forms of utilitarianism. We're going to be talking about one form of utilitarianism much later in the course. Now, there are also religiously based ethical theories, the most famous of which would be divine command theories. Now, divine command theories are going to be united by the belief that what is right and what is wrong will be determined by God, typically regarded as the creator. And the idea is that God wants what's best for people, and that God is determining what is right or wrong through God's commands. What God commands us to do is supposed to be right. What God condemns is supposed to be wrong. And that has been a very popular theory. Now, there have been people who have raised objections. Even people very sympathetic to the theory will sometimes say that, yes, that they believe in God. Yes, they believe that God wants what's best for us. But they will say that sometimes people can differ over what God's commands are, right? Because we have different holy books representing God's will, or at least claiming to represent God's will, in different religions. And sometimes even within the same religion, people can disagree. You can have people who are Christian differing over the death penalty. And if they look at what is called the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, there are many death penalties. The New Testament is more ambiguous, because we know of at least one instance in which Jesus tells people who are about to stone, some Jewish people who were about to stone a woman who supposedly committed adultery. He says, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." At least in that case, it looks like Jesus was rejecting the death penalty. At least in that case, there are other parts of the New Testament, as in parts of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus says, "Follow every jot and tittle, every detail of the law," meaning the Mosaic law, which included several death penalties. And so you can have people even belonging to the same religion, as in the case of Christians, differing over whether God currently approves of the death penalty. Okay, so that's one of the challenges to that theory, but I don't want to go too deeply into this. There are lots of interesting questions you could ask about it. I mean, one question is, how do we know that we've accurately interpreted God's will, assuming that God exists? And another question you could ask is something right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? And if something is right because and only because God commands it, does that mean God could command beating people up for the fun of it, and would that make it right? And if someone says, well, no, God wouldn't do that because that's just plain wrong. Well, if someone said that, it looks as if that person isn't saying then that God's commands are making something right or wrong, and that we could, in principle, talk about right and wrong without direct reference to God. But anyway, that gets very complicated. So let's talk further about, so we've talked about ethics, and then there's metaphysics. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy dealing with the ultimate nature of reality and existence. What is ultimately real? What exists? Is there a creator God? And then you'd have to define what you mean by that. What is the nature of persons? Are persons required to have a body? Is it possible that a person could exist without a body? Sometimes people refer to God as a disembodied person, and some people believe that people can survive their physical deaths because they are essentially non-physical souls or spirits. So anyway, so what is the ultimate nature of persons? Is there a creator God? What is the ultimate nature of time? What is there free will? You'd have to define free will, but those are some of the areas of metaphysics. And there's also aesthetics. Aesthetics deals with the ultimate nature of art and beauty. It asks questions about what ultimately is art. What is art simply in the eye of the artist? Is beauty simply in the eye of the beholder? Okay, so that's aesthetics. Okay, we're not going to study that in great detail, but I want you to know those basic definitions. Okay, also, I want you to know a little bit about logic. Logic is the branch of philosophy dealing with correct reasoning. There are different forms of logic, okay? And two of the most popular forms of logic are deductive logic, which is very mathematical. It's a kind of logic that one sees in geometry. And there's also inductive logic. Those are the two most common forms of logic. Deductive logic is very, again, mathematical. You could, in fact, express various arguments in the premises of the premises and the conclusions using symbols. Okay, and you could, and there are rules for determining whether you have a valid deductive argument or not. I don't want to go into great detail about what the symbols are going to look like, but I will say this. Let me just give you one example. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. This can be written in different ways. But anyway, so you look at that. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Okay. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Okay, so that's expressing a deductive argument. Those are the premises. In this case, you have two premises and a conclusion. So that's an if-then statement, and then the part of it, the if part, you're asserting, and then the then is supposed to follow. So I don't know. Let me give you an example. So if you say if somebody's a person, the person's a mammal, and then you say President Trump is a person, therefore he's a mammal, that's a valid deductive argument. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's say first, what is a deductive argument? A deductive argument would be at least one premise. Typically it has more, but it's at least one premise, and it's usually more than one premise. Okay, and then you're going to have a conclusion. And the idea is that the premise is asserted to logically imply the conclusion, so that if one were to say yes to the premise or premises and no to the conclusion, one would be contradicting oneself. Let me give you an example of a deductive argument with only one premise. And it goes this way. It goes, no Baptists or polar bears. And I bet you've never heard that statement before. Well, you have now. No Baptists or polar bears. Therefore, no polar bears are Baptists. That is an immediate inference. It's an immediate inference. So you have, okay, so look at that. No Baptists or polar bears, therefore no polar bears are Baptists. Okay, so that is, you could even use Venn diagrams to show that follows, but you don't intuitively, I mean, you just think about it. If you say no Baptists or polar bears, okay, you're saying that the class of Baptists and class of polar bears don't intermingle in any way. They don't overlap in any way. And that would mean that if there are no Baptists or polar bears, it necessarily follows that no polar bears are Baptists. So that's a deductive argument, but it's a valid one because it would be self-contradictory for someone to say, yes, I agree, no Baptists or polar bears, but I reject the conclusion that no polar bears are Baptists. Okay? Now, not all arguments are deductive. Not all deductive arguments are valid. I mean, let me give you an example. Suppose someone says that if it rained last night, my lawn will be wet this morning. My lawn's wet this morning, therefore it rained last night. So that would be if P then Q, Q therefore P, which would be invalid. Now, why would that be an invalid argument? Okay, so here's what's going on with this. Okay, not, whoops, right there. If P then Q, whoops. If P, okay, you see that? If P then Q, Q therefore P. Okay, so why is that invalid? Well, if you say if P then Q, you're saying that the condition P is sufficient to bring about Q. And then you say Q, therefore P. Well, let's look at this. If it rained last night, my lawn's wet this morning. My lawn's wet this morning, therefore it must have rained last night. Okay. Well, here's the problem. Yes, if it rained last night, that could be a sufficient condition for your lawn's being wet this morning. But your lawn could be wet this morning for reasons that have nothing to do with its having rained last night. So therefore, it could have rained this morning, and that's why your lawn is wet this morning. It could, in fact, be the case that you have a sprinkler system, and that's why your lawn's wet. It could be there was dew, morning dew, and that's why your lawn is wet this morning, right? There could be a sewer line that is burst, and that's why your lawn's wet this morning, and so on. So just because it may be true, if P then Q, then you go, okay, that's one premise. That can be true. It can also be true that they have Q, okay, but it wouldn't follow that you've got P, because another way to say it is, if somebody's the President of the United States, the person has to be at least 35 years of age, according to the Constitution, right? And then you say, well, and then so-and-so is at least 35 years of age, and therefore that person's President of the United States. Well, that wouldn't follow. It's very, very easy for people to hit 35 years of age and not become president. People do it all the time. So in any event, not all arguments are deductive. Not all deductive arguments are valid. But here's what we can say. If you have a valid deductive argument, that means that the premises logically imply the conclusion, so that if you said yes to the premises but no to the conclusion, you would be contradicting yourself. Okay? Now, deductive arguments, or deduction if you like, will aim at logical certainty. In other words, the idea is if you postulate certain things, certain premises, what necessarily follows? What necessarily follows? Okay, so that's to do with logical certainty. Think of geometry. You're given various. You have assumptions. You have postulates, and you've got postulates, and you've got your assumptions. You've got definitions. But from these things, one can necessarily conclude various theorems. See? And prove them. But in any event, so think of, that's how deductive logic is supposed to work. That's how it's supposed to work. Deductive logic, again, is aiming at logical certainty. What necessarily follows given other starting points, or given various starting points. Okay, now inductive logic does not aim at logical certainty, but it aims at probability. The goal, so here's what happens. Even in what we call a strong inductive argument, normally we don't use the word valid when it comes to inductive logic, but we say a strong inductive argument, even with true premises, is one in which the conclusion will follow with some degree of probability. It's supposed to be at least more likely true than not. Okay, so let me give you an example. Suppose I go to a Wendy's restaurant, like Wendy's fast food, right? Suppose I always order the same thing, and it's at a particular restaurant, and I always order iced tea. And let's suppose I've done this 1,000 times in a row. And let's suppose furthermore that I'm about to go the 1,001st time. Okay, we could say that I will most likely enjoy that iced tea, but it's entirely possible that I will not. Why? Because let's suppose we could have a situation in which the manager wants to save money, so the manager commands that the tea have a lot more water in it, or more water, or they let's suppose that somebody, as a practical joke, put hot sauce in the iced tea, or let's suppose that somebody accidentally was bleeding into the iced tea, and I started drinking and noticed that a little too late. Well, then I wouldn't enjoy it, right? So we could say that yes, that's a strong inductive argument. If I've gone to the same Wendy's for 1,000 days in a row and always enjoy the iced tea, it's pretty likely, very likely, that I'll enjoy it the 1,001st time. Okay, so the conclusion will follow, but it follows with a high degree of probability, but not logical certainty. It's not a contradiction in terms for us to say, yes, it's true, I've gone to this Wendy's 1,000 times in a row, and now the 1,001st time I've gone, and yet I don't like the iced tea for some of the reasons I've mentioned, okay, or any of the reasons I've mentioned. Okay, so inductive logic does not aim at logical certainty, but it aims at probability. Okay, And a strong inductive argument through premises will have a conclusion that is likely to be true, very likely to be true, but it doesn't have to be true. It doesn't, logically speaking, there's no logical implication or necessity or certainty. Okay, so in any event, that's philosophy, again, deals with the ultimate nature of correct reasoning, and we call that logic. And deductive logic, again, is highly mathematical, and you can express, in fact, deductive arguments using symbols, and there are rules of inference for them, and you can even have computer programs telling you whether you have a valid deductive argument or not once you've translated natural language, such as English, and into symbols, symbolic notation. By the way, again, if we talk about deductive logic, here's what we can say. If we have a valid deductive argument, then that means that the premises logically imply the conclusion. Then that means that it would be self-contradictory to say yes to the premises while saying no to the conclusion. Okay? But that doesn't mean that, as a matter of fact, either any of the premises or even the conclusion, that any of that must be true. It simply means that the premises logically imply the conclusion, so that if all the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true. But it's entirely possible to have a valid deductive argument with a false conclusion. Now, how does that work? Think of this. Suppose I say all people are reptiles. President Trump is a person, therefore he's a reptile. That is a valid deductive argument, and yet the conclusion is false. We have garbage out. Well, we must have put garbage in, as indeed we did, because it's not true that all people are reptiles, they're mammals. But my point is that a valid deductive argument can have a false conclusion. Now, it can have a false conclusion, but the only way for that to happen is to have had at least one false premise. So if you have a valid deductive argument and you have a false conclusion, you know that at least one of the premises must be false. Okay, correlatively, we can say that if you have a valid deductive argument and the premises are all true, then the conclusion must be true. Because it will always be self-contradictory to say yes to the premises of a valid deductive argument and no the conclusion. So the premises of a valid deductive argument always imply the conclusion, but that doesn't mean, as a matter of fact, that the premises are true or that the conclusion has to be true. All we can say, though, that if all the premises are true of a valid deductive argument, the conclusion has to be true. We can say that. And we can also say of a valid deductive argument, if the conclusion is in fact false, we must have had at least one false premise. We got garbage out, we must have put garbage in. Okay, now finally what I want to talk about is epistemology. And by the way, the introduction to this book, Philosophy, Contemporary Perspectives on Perennial Issues, actually gets into a lot of this first lecture in the branches of philosophy. Okay, so and what I encourage people to do, although this is not going to be a particularly long lecture, some of the lectures are going to be a good deal longer than this, but what I encourage people to do is obviously to stop the lecture if something's confusing and you want to hear it again. And I always think that, after 25 minutes or so, it's a good idea to pause the lecture and to move around, make sure you're drinking water, so that you'll end up understanding more, you'll be less fatigued, you'll remember more, because we remember more of what we first learn and what we last learn. And so if you have frequent but brief breaks, you're going to end up being able to learn more, remember more. So the great thing about these video lectures is that you can pause them at any given time and you can go over stuff again. Furthermore, you're going to also have written lectures to complement these, so you'll have both. Now that doesn't mean you shouldn't be reading the book, doing the readings, but what I'm saying is it will help a lot that we've got both a video presentation and we've got written lecture notes, that you can have both for these lectures, okay? And you'll find out that you'll also, I think, profit from the reviews for each of our 4 tests. I think you'll profit from them too. So let's talk finally about the branch of philosophy called epistemology. Epistemology. So then the question is, well, what is epistemology? I mean, that sounds like a pretty big college word, and you might think that if I'm learning about epistemology, I'm really getting my money's worth. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy dealing with the nature, source or sources, and the limits of knowledge. Okay? Nature, sources of knowledge, and limits of knowledge. Nature of knowledge is what is knowledge. Let me show you again. What is knowledge? The definition. Okay? Definition of knowledge, nature of knowledge. Sources would be can we learn through, can we know through intuition, can we know through the five senses, can we know through faith, can we know through ESP. Those are different possible sources of knowledge, or they may or may not be sources of knowledge, but people claim them as sources of knowledge. And then the limits of knowledge would be the fact that presumably we can't know everything. There's some things we can't know. We have finite minds. When it comes to history, we need some sort of documentation. And even when we have documentation, sometimes it's very far from complete. It's impossible for us to know, I would argue, all the thoughts, really, of all the thoughts of anybody, even now, much less all the thoughts of, say, Thomas Jefferson. Because, for one thing, even if Thomas Jefferson was a voluminous writer, and he had, diaries, letters, or whatever, but I'm sure he had thoughts that he didn't write down, right? And so we don't even have. So I would argue that we just can't know. In fact, I doubt very seriously, as a matter of fact, we can know all the thoughts of anybody, even right now, much less somebody who lived hundreds of years ago. But in any event, so there are going to be limits. Some people deny that we can know far into the future. Some people, there are a lot of things. So people just say we just can't know. So limits of knowledge. So the nature, what is the definition of knowledge? Okay, a very popular definition of knowledge, especially what is called propositional knowledge. A proposition is something that can be true or false. You can express the same proposition using different language. Let's say es regnet could be it is raining in German, or I could just say it is raining in English and express the same proposition. Okay, and so what is the nature of propositional knowledge? Some people say a traditional definition is justified true belief. Justified true belief, right? So in any event, so let's talk about this. So knowledge, what is the definition of knowledge? One definition is a justified true belief. I'll get into that in a moment. Sources of knowledge, there are some people who claim that we, in order to have substantial knowledge about the world, we need to engage one or more of our five senses. You don't need to know this right now, but they're called empiricists. There are other people who maintain that we can sometimes know some very fundamental truths about the world through reason alone, and that reason must supervise sense experience to determine the extent to which we can rely on it. Because sometimes we have mirages, sometimes they're optical illusions, and so the people who emphasize the role of reason when it comes to sense experience are rationalists. We'll talk more about this later when I'll have some words to say about Descartes. And then there are, again, questions about the limits of knowledge. So, okay, so here's the thing. Here's a question for you. Let's suppose that I know some proposition. And then my question to you is, does it have to be true? Think about it. Now, some people may say, well, no, it doesn't. They go, no. Some people, but think about this for a moment. If you are, let's say, living in Virginia Beach and you're looking at this video, okay, could you know, while you're looking at the video in Virginia Beach, that you are in Richmond, Virginia? Could you know that? And you can say, well, I could definitely believe it. Yeah, you could. You could believe it. But could you know it? And I think people would say, well, if you're in Virginia Beach, you can't know you're in Richmond at the same time because you're not in Richmond, so therefore you can't believe something that's false. So it looks as if you have, for propositional knowledge, that is required that it has to be correct. Okay. Now someone might say that you've got to have more than a true belief, because you could have a true belief that when you have a scratch-off ticket that you're going to win. It wouldn't follow that you knew unless you have adequate or sufficient evidence. So some people think in some way it has to be justified, your true belief, and that is a very long discussion that we don't have to work with right now. But I do want you to think about what is knowledge, what qualifies as knowledge. Here's another question I have for you, and here's how it goes. Suppose there's a barber who is in a village who shaves all and only those people who don't shave themselves. Does the barber shave himself? And if you say yes or no, you're going to get in trouble. Because if you say yes, I would say, well, no, he just shaves those who don't shave themselves. And if you say no, he doesn't shave himself, but I'll say no, but he shaves all those people who don't shave themselves. And so here's the problem. We're assuming that it's a legitimate question. It's part of what is called the barber paradox. Now, what does that mean? The fact of the matter is, it's not a legitimate question because the way it's framed, the barber would have to both shave and not shave himself, which is impossible. Okay? So one thing in philosophy does is to teach us to question the questions. Don't assume that because some piece of language looks sensible and meaningful that they're not logical problems with it. Okay, so sometimes we have to question the questions. I mean, some people can say, well, I can run faster than someone else, you know, and then someone could say, I don't need much sleep because I sleep really fast. Well, it's not clear what that means. Or how about this? I could ask you, what time is it in Fargo, North Dakota? And some of you would know. Well, some of you might think it's going to be 2 hours earlier than on the East Coast, but well, it's going to be 1 hour. It's not quite west enough to. But my point is, there's a definite answer to that question. But suppose I ask you, what time is it on the sun? We don't have any definite criteria for that. Okay, so it's a grammatically correct question, but it has some really serious logical problems. So in any event, one of the things you need to do is to learn to understand and sometimes question questions, because philosophy involves a critical openness. It involves analyzing things, including one's own beliefs, but also being open to other points of view and not simply believing something because it's comfortable or because we were taught it by someone we respect or because it's traditional. One of the things that people learn about in particularly Western philosophy is the importance of individual questioning, the importance of asking for evidence and proof, and that's part of what it is to think philosophically. And we're going to try to hone your skills in this class. Okay. So again, to go over some key points, there's only one book for this class. It's this one, Philosophy Can Never Respect Its Own Perennial Issues. Again, the ISBN is 0312-08478 and then 1. 0312-08478 and then 1. This is the only book you'll need. All the readings will be in that book. Now, next class, we're going to be talking about skepticism, radical skepticism, the proposition that we can know little or nothing, and perhaps even nothing about the physical world. So we're going to have different perspectives on this. We're going to have a guy named Peter Unger who claims that we cannot know for sure anything about the physical world, even that rocks exist. Now, when you read Unger, I want you to think of, and it's called A Defense of Skepticism in our book, near the beginning of the book, I want you to think of the Matrix movies, if you've seen any of them. And what I want you to do is think of the idea of someone having a computer program and actually manufacturing people's thoughts and perceptions so that what people think is real really isn't. Okay? Because that's what Unger is doing. Because Unger is going to say it is possible for some brain scientists to manipulating your brain or my brain so that you or I will believe that something's real when it's not. We could believe that rocks are real when they aren't. And he says it's possible that we won't even be able to determine whether we are being fooled or not. And so Unger is going to say that if we have knowledge, what we know must be true. And he's going to think also and say that that means we can't be mistaken. But he even goes a bit further. He seems to be implying that if we know something, including that rocks exist, that it can't even be conceivable or theoretically possible that we're mistaken. But he says, well, but guess what? It is theoretically possible that we're mistaken, because it's theoretically possible that some brain scientist is fooling you or me, undetectably fooling you or me, into believing that rocks exist when they don't. And he says, well, we can't know for sure that that's not happening. And so therefore, he says, we can't know that rocks exist, because we can always be mistaken about whether they exist, and we could be incorrigibly mistaken, so that we wouldn't be able to be corrected. And that's a very interesting sort of claim. So we're going to be talking about that, and the essay that follows that is by John Hospers, who rejects radical skepticism. So his essay is called A Critique of Skepticism. See? So Unger represents that extreme view of radical skepticism, and Unger is going to say we can't know anything for sure about the physical world, including that rocks exist. And then the next essay after that is by John Hospers, and Hospers is going to argue that there are all sorts of things we can know, including that rocks exist, although sometimes we think we know and we don't. But there are all sorts of things we can know, and he's going to argue that we don't have to have infallibility to have knowledge. And we're going to talk more about this next time. Okay. Now I want to encourage you to obviously to do the readings, to look very carefully over the documents under syllabus on Blackboard, and especially the syllabus itself, and obviously the lecture notes, right? And also under syllabus, it gives you the review sheets for each of the tests. And a lot of people find it helpful to look at the review sheet for the first test while they're doing the readings and studying the lecture notes, so they'll know what's going to be asked on the first test. Okay, so you obviously want to look at the video lectures. You're going to want to do the readings, and you're going to very carefully look at not just what I just mentioned, but the readings and the lecture notes, the written lecture notes. And the other thing I would do if I were you, I would create flashcards for technical terms, and I would also for people's positions, what positions they represent. And I would end up shuffling them. You could either, if you can do it digitally, you can know how to do that. And if not, even if they're physical flash, you shuffle them, you put them in different orders, and you regularly review them. And you'll find out that those flashcards will help you learn and memorize a lot of material. And that if you have to recall material, that's typically much better than simply reading and rereading it. So you actually want to have to recall material, you want to apply it, you want to, if anything, talk with other people about what you've learned, and even give a little lecture to other people if you could. And if you don't want to do that, then I don't care if you talk to your stuffed animals, but even learning something with a view to giving a lecture, even to inanimate objects, and actually giving that lecture can be very helpful in your mastering the material. Now, if you're talking with other people, they could ask you questions about it, and you could have obviously interaction, which would be very good. But I do encourage you to apply the material, to try to paraphrase it, in front of other people, whether you're friends or family, and to give a little mini lecture either to real people or to your stuffed animals. But in any event, I would encourage you to do that. I would encourage you also to create flashcards for this material. And I think if you do all this stuff, you do the readings, you repeatedly go over the videos, you stop the videos when you need to take a break, and then you go over them again, you take notes from them, you create flashcards, I think that'll be great. And then you do the same thing with your written lectures, which I have for you as well. So in any event, the other thing is, if you have any questions or any concerns about any of this material or anything else related to the course, I encourage you to email me. We can also, if you like, set up phone chats so that we can have, and they can be, whether it's a few minutes or they could be half hour or more. But we could do this. I would be more than happy to do this. I want you to stay in touch with me. I want to stay in touch with you. It's very important also that you daily check your email for any course that has any online feature. And if it's a completely online course, it's enormously important that you regularly check your email, ideally every day. Ideally every day. And by the way, when I hear from you through the email, when I see your email, I will respond, even if just saying thank you, to let you know that I saw what you sent. So if you send me an email and you don't hear from me for 24 hours later, you need to either call or send it again, because for whatever reason, I most likely didn't see your email. Okay, well, that's going to be it for today, the first lecture for Philosophy 110P, Introduction to Philosophy at Old Dominion University. Thank you.